Hey friends, thanks for joining me, Jim Baroud, to hear a few insights from leaders who represent our innovation ecosystem. Today's chat is with Rebecca Fannin, author and CNBC contributor, and Justin Kosmides, co-founder and CEO of Vela Bikes.
I've been working on my new book, Silicon Heartland, which is launching March 7, and we're marching forward. And I have been writing quite a bit for CNBC lately, and I'm excited about the launch of my book and the book tour coming up.
Fantastic. Okay, Justin, go ahead.
Sure. So I am currently, we are in the later stages of moving our production to Detroit from China. And we are scaling up an electric bike company and getting ready for an exciting year ahead, and scaling across the United States here.
Wonderful. Okay, so Rebecca, you have an amazing career. Tell us right out of college, what that arc was like.
Right out of college from Ohio University to New York City with a job at Crane Communications. And from there, I went to Silicon Valley and I was covering venture capital and tech during the last real big boom and also bust. So I followed the money over to China, and I wrote a book called Silicon Dragon, which came out in 2008. And then I followed the money. I kept following the venture capital money, which has led to a good trail to India, Southeast Asia. My second book, Startup Asia. My third book, Tech Titans of China, which came out in 2019. It talked about how the Silicon Dragon babies grew into these tech titans of China. And we saw companies grow up like Alibaba and Baidu and Tencent. I'm still following that story with ByteDance and all the US-China frictions today. So I started working on my new book during COVID or right before COVID, and doing a Heartland tour by car, stopping from city to city. I covered probably about 10,000 miles and did interviews with mayors, town champions, entrepreneurs, tech innovators, leaders of economic development. And I visited about 30 cities, and it was great. It was wonderful. People were available for interviews and no problem there. And then I wrote the book, and the book's launching March 7th. So it's my fourth book, and it's doing well.
Show us the book.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Silicon Heartland. And, my prior book, I'm known as the Dragon Lady. Book,
which I have as well, which is we met right before the pandemic, I think 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago in Jamaica at a tech conference. And I was so impressed with this book. And
Silicon Dragon was my first one.
That's your first one. Okay, got it.
That's why people have known me as the Dragon Lady.
Okay, great. Well, we could spend the whole thing just talking about Asia, but we're not. We might dive into that a little bit. So let's talk to Justin. Justin, tell us about your career arc.
Sure. After school, I graduated in the middle of the 08 recession, and someone studying real estate probably wasn't the best time to be graduating. And I spent the better part of a little over a decade in the investment banking world, focused on commercial real estate and developments throughout the country. And I had always invested and been fascinated by the startup world and wanting to get involved in it. I also have always been an avid cyclist, and really got the experience of my first e-bike during my banking years and realized the benefits of being able to get around cities, both New York and Los Angeles and every city in between, from Denver to Austin. And really seeing the benefits of those electric bikes, from faster commutes, less traffic. You're not sweating when you show up at places. You can go further distances, still gives you a cardiovascular workout, albeit at a lower tier. It allows you to carry more weight, so it allows you to carry groceries or bags. And it really transformed how I got around cities and really enjoyed my quality of life. I saw the waves starting to hit the United States of the electric bike world and got involved early, and started to launch this brand, which was originally started in Sao Paulo, Brazil by my co-founder. We launched the brand in the United States in the 2019 going into 2020. And we saw an incredible pickup of ridership among early first-time adopters. Over 80% of our riders were new to the space, and over 2/3 were female. So we really knew we had something special, something different, and so then we started to scale up the brand, and that logically and quite frankly, the only option at the time was through China. You can expect that scaling production and a new product in China was difficult, nearly impossible, but we were able to pull it off for the better part of 2 years. But we noticed issues with tariffs, issues with shipping, issues with quality control, issues with communication, issues with, quite frankly, every company from large to small have been dealing with over the past couple of years. That's why Apple's diversifying their production. That's why big and small companies are looking at onshoring or nearshoring, and something that we wanted to do, quite frankly, from the beginning, but we're unable to. We partnered up with the largest bike builder, which is based in Bentonville, Arkansas, which has become an incredible community around Bentonville. But they had the largest steel manufacturing facility, bike manufacturing facility in Detroit. We were lucky enough, after a year of due diligence and working with them, to start producing our bikes in October of 2022. And since then, we've been scaling up production and getting ready for this next spring, summer, and fall season, and could not be more excited about it. We're already seeing benefits from that shift, and excited about the future and our ability to use capital more efficiently, launch new product, access to better financing because we've got all of our investment here on shore. And quite frankly, the only disadvantage, slightly higher labor costs, quite frankly, works out in the end to be an advantage for us with better quality and better service in the future. And I think, as I said on another interview about 2 weeks ago, it's something that I want more and more CEOs around the country to start seriously taking into consideration. And I know a number are, but this needs to be accelerated, and there's a large amount of advantages that we're seeing.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And also, obviously, shipping times and shipping costs, which were extraordinarily high during the pandemic,
Yep.
That's helpful in that way too. So, and it's just great to have manufacturing, back in Detroit. The more, the better, frankly. And hopefully one day we can talk about this, the potential for subsidies for locally sourced bikes or
Yep.
mobility. So, Rebecca, clearly we're seeing this move to the heartland, as you speak about in your book. Can you speak to startup ecosystems, right, that you saw them overseas and now you're seeing them here? Tell us what makes a robust and thriving ecosystem as you saw it from afar, and what you're seeing now percolating in the States.
There's a number of factors that are drivers of this innovation ecosystem that's happening in the inland of the United States. First of all, we're seeing a lot more venture capital springing up from coastal VCs even coming in, and from the inland VC firms raising their own funds, and seeing some success stories from the first entrepreneurs that they've backed through IPOs and exits. And you're seeing talent moving in from the coast as well. I think the pandemic was a real tipping point, and a number of people picked up and left Silicon Valley. Cost of living issues. You can remote work anywhere today. So these are all have been drivers of this new tech talent, this building up the Midwest. We're seeing the idea of reinvention through government as well. Government spending is part of this. The federal government has allocated a lot of money through the CHIPS Act and through semiconductor manufacturing for the Midwest. So that's another driver. We're seeing the infrastructure being rebuilt, which really needs to be. If you compare it with what has been in China, or what I saw in China, it's really not a good comparison. We've seen a lot of people want to be in the startup economy. They don't want to work in big corporations anymore, and I think COVID escalated that. We're seeing a livability in cities like Detroit and Columbus and Pittsburgh, where before maybe you didn't have great restaurants, maybe you didn't have, a kind of a startup vibe in these places. But today, these cities all have tech clusters and within their cities. So, for instance, Pittsburgh has its own Silicon Valley type area. Detroit does. Columbus does. And they're all specialized. For instance, Detroit is really a lot about mobility and advanced manufacturing. So the e-bike story is a great example. And I love, that it shifted from China to Detroit to manufacturing. That's really what I'm talking about in my book, about this reinvention of the U.S. economy. And, the Heartland was the pinnacle of U.S. innovation in the past, going back decades, right? But that was lost to Silicon Valley and to Boston and to New York City, and now we're starting to see this reverse pattern happening. So I think it's very positive, and each city has its own cluster specialization. Like I said, Detroit with mobility, Cleveland has a lot of biotech around the Cleveland Clinic. Carnegie Mellon is a driver in Pittsburgh with AI and robotics. Columbus has a lot of insurance tech and health tech. Nationwide Insurance is based there. So P&G and Kroger in Cincinnati are driving a lot of packaged goods innovation and sustainability innovation. So it's been really remarkable to see these clusters develop in these various cities. And I think that that's a good foundation for this comeback story.
That's really a good overview, Rebecca, because, we started seeing this before the pandemic, the rise of the rest, as Steve Case has spoken about. But the pandemic really accelerated it, right? People could live anywhere.
Right.
And I guess the growth will just continue. There's nothing that will stop it. And that's the beautiful thing. And all the VC money now. Can you just talk about the VC money? Is that now flowing more broadly across the country, regardless of where the investors themselves are located? Is that a reality that will stick?
There's been a huge gap in venture capital spending, that the coast had 75% of the money, and that's been that way for several years. It's starting to shift. We're seeing VC funding in the Midwest quadruple in the last decade, and the number of startups really escalate as well. Well, we're starting to see some success stories, IPOs and M&A deals in the Heartland. That creates entrepreneurial heroes like we saw in Silicon Valley, who go on to create other startups. And that whole feeds the ecosystem. So you are really seeing these startup hubs take hold. And I think as they do, it's not going to stop. I think it would just continue to escalate. Another factor is a number of these cities are really encouraging talent to move in. They're not afraid of promoting their benefits and actually even paying people to move, to relocate. For instance, Tulsa has done that, and West Virginia has done that. And those programs have been successful.
Yeah, no, that's and I think the smart communities or states have leveraged a lot of the pandemic funding to support incentives, right, and support of the infrastructure, of entrepreneurs, of investments. And I know we've seen it here in New Jersey, and I think it's happened broadly across the Midwest. So, Justin, tell us how you've viewed. You're coming from New York, new lab. You're looking at Detroit, started manufacturing. How do you see those communities? And can compare and contrast them, please?
Yeah, it is. One thing, some great comments there by Rebecca. I mean, it really is the concentration of mobility and the fact that for well over 100 years, Detroit has not only been the manufacturing hub for, quite frankly, the world for many of those years, but definitely the capital of mobility. What once was cars, but also bikes. One of the largest. Henry Ford started producing bikes before he started producing cars. And really, when we started to seriously consider moving production to the U.S., it was, there were only a few options, but Detroit really gave us the ability to leverage off of a lot of the history. So we were able to, the former auto workers who can weld, but also the battery technology that electric car companies are working on. We were able to leverage off of all of that in one space. And quite frankly, within a couple of days of us announcing and starting to really work our way into the ecosystem there, we were having suppliers and people reach out wanting to help and wanting to be part of it. And that is the definition of an ecosystem that can lift and really be a part of. And that really is the benefit of being part of a community. I mean, I'm not putting down the New York community and the Brooklyn and all these incredible spaces here that we have, and there's obviously a rich history of startups in New York, but I'm talking about for us in particular, going to a city like Detroit and investing and really going into it. The number of inbound messages were a lot higher when we decided to announce our move to Detroit than they were when we were launching here in New York. And it's that smaller fish in bigger pond, and that dynamic that you're always looking for in terms of having a support mechanism, because no founder can do it on their own. They need the investment from the local community and local investors. They need the support from public and private, and they need customers, and they need all of that together, and all of it to come together in one clean system for us to possibly succeed. And that is really for us to be now invested in Detroit, as Detroit's also invested in us. That is a beautiful thing. And as Rebecca was saying, you can look at that for robotics in Pittsburgh. You can look at that in many of these other markets, what Dell did for Austin, and many of these other kind of marriages that help build and support local community and a local platform that, quite frankly, allowed us to step in and press play very quickly in the market, which we could have never done in many other markets.
You mentioned bikes starting out, Henry Ford starting out with bikes. I'm thinking about the Wright brothers. They started with bikes too. So that's kind of funny. And certainly Dayton is one of these turnaround stories. A number of corporations left Dayton, and huge unemployment, opioid addiction, the whole downtown deserted. And now we're seeing opportunity zone investment come in, and a number of startups that are feeding off the Air Force Research Lab that's in Dayton. And so Dayton is also attracting some of this new kind of startup activity that is specialized as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's really amazing, right? All the activity going on throughout the Midwest, and I think the welcoming culture, right? It's in the city, New York City. It's really delightful. It must be delightful.
Well, that's what they say about Midwesterners. They're nice, they're welcoming. It's a very different culture in the Midwest. I'm from the Heartland, so I know. I'm from Ohio, southeastern Ohio, and from a rural town. And so I know a good bit about it. And so when I went back to do the reporting for this book, I felt right at home with the people. And there is a lot of grit in the Heartland, GRIT, grit, and determination of the people. It's a very hardworking region, and it's not the same energy that you see in Silicon Valley or New York or Boston. It's its own energy, but it's happening. Maybe there's not enough exposure to it yet, but I like to be one of those trend spotters. I was early to China before anyone believed that China tech was anything, and I was one of the first journalists in China reporting about entrepreneurship in China. And nobody really wanted to hear that message in Silicon Valley. Today, I see a little bit of that happening with the Heartland story, but at least we're all united. We're all America, one America, right? It is a comeback story for the U.S., and I will probably hear a lot more about that on the State of the Union address tonight, too.
Well, speaking of those entrepreneurs, Rebecca, are there any that you want to highlight that are the next unicorn, or anything that really struck you as sort of impactful and representative?
Well, there are so many; it's hard to name one. But if I look at Cleveland, the number of biotech innovations that are coming out for that can really change human health, I think that those are lasting kinds of signs of progress that maybe we didn't see before and that it is different kind of innovation than what we saw in Silicon Valley. Silicon Valley is very tech centralized. Now in Boston has its own, New York has its own tech, but the Heartland also has its own tech, which is very much directed at the way people live and work today. So I think it can have an overall impact. There's so many case studies in my book from Detroit and Flint even, and Youngstown. In Youngstown, there's a great 3D printing company that got started. It was about to go out of business when the owner discovered 3D printing, and the whole Youngstown community got behind him and created this whole advanced manufacturing cluster in Youngstown. And today, this company is doing well, and it's through this kind of neighborhoodish kind of community that you probably wouldn't see in Silicon Valley or New York, but it's very dominant in the Midwest. So companies like it's called, excuse me, Humtown, Humtown. And it's in this really remote area of northeastern Ohio. You go down country roads to find it, and you would never notice it otherwise. But they're creating these products for manufacturing, advanced manufacturing. And it's a foundry that was about to go out of business because all the foundries in the U.S. were about to go out of business until they discovered 3D printing. So that's a story I like very much because it's such an amazing turnaround story. Right.
Justin, when you mentioned all the inbound, and obviously Rebecca was just mentioning, warm people are in the Midwest, and talked about community, obviously. Give us a bit more color on how the response was. In addition to the engagement, was there additional incentives that you could take advantage of, or funding, or tell us more about that?
Yeah, what Rebecca was just describing, and the long list of advantages. I mean, it really also is something where it's people looking out for each other and having each other's back and wanting to collectively come together for something bigger and stronger. But it's also rooting a little bit for the underdog. I was born and raised in Baltimore, and you get a little bit of that feeling where it's like we're kind of all in this together. We're all looking out for each other, and even if we might have a little bit of competition, we're looking out and working together for something bigger. We had suppliers reaching out to us, investors reaching out to us, press reaching out to us. I mean, it's really from all sides, but it's also people reaching out saying, "Hey, I live close by, and I just love what you're doing, and I'm super supportive of what you're doing." I mean, these are risky decisions as an entrepreneur to make these kind of, it's a lot easier for me to go to a supplier in China and say, "Hey, order me a bunch of these and in this color and have it show up at this port on this date." It's a lot more risky for us, from capital to time to energy, to really make this investment. And so it takes a community, and it takes, quite frankly, an area to come together and to support a lot of this. So could not have been a warmer, more supportive welcome. And I'm sure it's similar in a lot of other industries and markets throughout the country. And again, it's not. Again, I'm located here in Brooklyn, New York, and have seen and experienced a lot of the tech industry on the West Coast, but it's very different when you get to kind of, we'll call it middle America or flyover, whatever term you want to use. It's the ability to really see something on a smaller scale and to work together on something to solve problems that I think brings out kind of the best of us as entrepreneurs. And it's something that is much more tangible and much more kind of coming together than something that is, you might not know your neighbor in many of those kind of, we'll call them coastal places.
Right. They're starting to call it fly in country rather than fly over country.
I love that.
That really is a great term. Now, Rebecca, tell us about how China and Asia is doing now. We hear a lot of, obviously, challenges that they're having, and obviously had challenges through, particularly recently with the pandemic and the supply chains. How do you see that region's ecosystem now as opposed to 4 or 5 years ago?
4 or 5 years ago was the peak, and we've been seeing a downturn throughout recent months, and I think valuations have come down for startups. I think the U.S.-China friction has hurt the China story. I think we're seeing more startups like his move to reshore and decouple from China. So that's not necessarily the best message for China. It's great for the U.S., but I think China has some really challenges ahead. We've seen the growth in the economy slow. We've seen the birth rate slow and population getting older. Lots of sections of China that have been left behind were developed too quickly and remain vacant. And that's another issue. We have seen funding from the U.S. for China in the venture capital firms really dwindle from what it used to be. Firms would wave so proud, we're doing U.S. China. Now they hide from it. They do not want to be associated with China, and there's a real image problem, and not just an image problem for China, but a real foundational problem for China. And so what we're seeing is this decoupling idea of China separating out from other markets and developing its own, relying on its own innovation rather than so much from Western countries. Another issue or trend I've been spotting is the development of Southeast Asia. It's moving from China to Southeast Asia markets like Indonesia and India and Singapore. And that's another trend that I think is going to continue as the China story becomes more challenging for international investors and business leaders.
That's fascinating insight, Rebecca, and we'll see how the future unfolds, frankly, as the ecosystems move, right? And the strength of them change. So this has been a great conversation. One thing I like to do is ask just one thing, a quick insight from each of you. So let me start with you, Rebecca. How can entrepreneurs best take advantage of startup hubs?
I think they need to move there. They need to be local. They cannot try to drive this from Silicon Valley or New York. If they're going to do manufacturing and technology innovation in Detroit or Flint or Dayton, they need to localize their team and be part of the community. So that would be my advice: is move the team in, move the founder in, move the CEO, vote with their feet.
Got it. Okay, Justin?
We've had the lucky opportunity of being a part of New Lab, which is behind me, around me. New Lab is just opening up their second location. Their first was here in Brooklyn. The second is in Detroit, in Michigan Central, which is an incredible project. And it's really, the benefit of a founder to be within a community of 1,600 members here who are going through and able to commiserate, but support and connect and really spread that is super, super important. And I think it's vital for startups, and to watch more of these communities grow. It is especially important in these smaller markets and areas that you find your community. That will help lift you up and support you.
Got it. Okay, this has been a great conversation. Let's, we usually typically close with a poem or a saying from our guests. So Rebecca, ladies first, go ahead.
Okay, look, writing Silicon Heartland was a real homecoming to me. I had been away from the Heartland for about 20 years, except for going back for family visits and holidays. So spending time in the Heartland was very heartwarming for me. It was an emotional journey. And so that's reflected in my book as well, because it's not just about the reinvention of the Midwest, it's about my own journey as a person as well. So yeah, you have to read the book.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Okay, Justin?
Well, it's somewhat ironic, but I've always had the Chinese farmer parable as a good learning lesson that I always think of, and I'm very fond of Eastern religion. But the premise is really, in many situations, you don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate, and so your response really has to be open to maybe or open to both something being fortunate or unfortunate. So whenever I've been faced over the past number of years of with a startup of something unfortunate happening, sometimes there's fortune embedded in that, and it's really, you need to be open to and listen to both sides of it. And so the Chinese farmer parable, everyone should look it up, Alan Watts. It really has helped as a founder.
Opportunity equals challenge equals opportunity. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So yeah. So my book on Amazon is listed. One of the categories it's listed under is Buddhism.
Is that right?
I love it.
How interesting.
Okay.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Well, this has been great, guys. Thank you so much for doing this. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the show. Please like it, leave a review, and subscribe. See you soon.